Some names are like constellations, vast and sprawling, their light traveling across generations, so bright they seem to belong to the sky itself rather than to mortal people. The name Kennedy is one of those constellations. For the better part of a century, it has been an American shorthand for a potent, paradoxical mix of power and pain, glamour and grief, public service and private scandal. It's a name that conjures images of presidential yachts sailing off the coast of Massachusetts, of touch football games played with ferocious intensity, of brilliant speeches that lifted a nation, and of sudden violent tragedies that brought it to its knees. The Kennedys have lived their lives on a global stage, their triumphs and their tears woven into the very fabric of the American story. But what happens when you're born into that constellation, not as a blazing sun, destined to be at its center, but as a smaller, more distant star? What is it like to navigate the gravitational pull of that immense legacy, to live in the echoes of that famous haunted past, all while trying to chart your own course and find your own light in the vastness of the present? This is the story of a Kennedy you may not know as well as the others, but whose life and whose heartbreakingly premature death tells us something profound and deeply necessary about the human heart, about the invisible burdens we inherit, and about the quiet, desperate battles so many of us fight in the shadows, far from the public gaze. This is the story of Saoirse Kennedy Hill. She was the granddaughter of Robert F. Kennedy, a young woman blessed with a poet's soul, a fiercely intelligent wit, and a passion for justice that was the very marrow in her bones, a direct inheritance from her storied lineage, but beneath the surface of a life that, from the outside, seemed gilded with every imaginable privilege and protection. She was grappling with a darkness that no famous name, no loving family could entirely shield her from. Her story is not one of politics or power in the way we typically associate with her family. It's a much more intimate, more modern, and for many, a painfully relatable story. It's about the universal search for identity, the grueling, often lonely struggle for mental wellness, and the immense courage it takes to speak your truth, even when your voice shakes with fear. It is a vital and poignant reminder that behind the grand, sweeping tapestries of history and dynasty, there are individual human lives, each one precious, each one fragile, and each one with a story that deserves to be told, to be listened to, and to be honored. To truly understand the world that Saoirse Kennedy Hill was born into, you have to understand that she wasn't just born into a family. She was born into a modern American myth. It was a myth forged in the mid-20th century, a time of immense change and confidence in America. At its center was her great-uncle John F. Kennedy, the handsome, charismatic president who, along with his elegant wife, Jacqueline, created an era in Washington that would be immortalized as Camelot. It was a time of perceived grace, intelligence, and youthful vigor, a new frontier of optimism that captivated the world. And right beside him was his younger brother, Saoirse's grandfather, Robert F. Kennedy. RFK was, in many ways, the soul of the operation. He began his career as a tough, sometimes ruthless political operator, the family's loyal enforcer. But over time, and especially after his brother's assassination in 1963, a profound transformation took place. He blossomed into a figure of deep compassion and moral courage, a champion for the poor, the marginalized, and the disenfranchised. He traveled to the destitute hollers of Appalachia, the impoverished Mississippi Delta, and the bleakest urban ghettos, speaking of a justice that was not yet a reality. Each time a man stands up for an ideal, he once said, or acts to improve the lot of others, or strikes out against injustice, he sends forth a tiny ripple of hope. This was the specific legacy Saoirse was born into, not just one of power, but one of empathy. Her grandmother was Ethel Kennedy, the fiercely devout and energetic matriarch of this branch of the family. After RFK was assassinated during his own presidential run in 1968, Ethel, pregnant with their 11th child, was left to raise her sprawling, heartbroken family alone. She did so with a strength that was nothing short of legendary, creating a world for her children at their home, Hickory Hill, that was defined by a boisterous, competitive, and loving chaos. But it was a world forever shaped by the profound, defining absence of their father. This history of high achievement and devastating loss created the legend of the Kennedy curse, a dark narrative of inexplicable tragedy that seemed to stalk the family through the generations. It began with the death of the eldest son, Joe Jr., in a secret bombing mission in World War II. It continued with the death of their sister Kathleen in a plane crash a few years later. Then came the two assassinations, which ripped the heart out of the family and the nation. But the tragedies didn't stop there. Saoirse's uncle David Kennedy, who had watched his father's assassination on television as a child, struggled with trauma and addiction for years before dying of a drug overdose in a Palm Beach hotel room in 1984. Another uncle, Michael, was killed in a skiing accident in 1997, the very year Saoirse was born. This was the backdrop of her life, a family that had reached the highest peaks of influence and had been plunged into the deepest valleys of grief, all under the relentless, unforgiving glare of public scrutiny. Every Kennedy child was born carrying this weight. Into this complex inheritance came Saoirse Hill, and her story has another layer of historical weight, one that comes from her father. Her mother, Courtney Kennedy, the fifth of RFK, and Ethel's children, married an Irish journalist named Paul Hill. Paul was not just any journalist. He was one of the Guildford Four, a group of 4 young people who were wrongfully arrested and convicted for a series of horrific IRA pub bombings in 1974. They were innocent, victims of a coerced confession and a system desperate for a conviction during the height of the Troubles in the United Kingdom. Paul Hill spent 15 years in a British prison for a crime he did not commit, his life stolen by a catastrophic miscarriage of justice. His story, and that of his co-accused, became a global cause célèbre, eventually being immortalized in the Oscar-nominated film In the Name of the Father. So Saoirse, whose name is the Gaelic word for freedom, was, from her very first breath, a living symbol of her family's dual legacies. From her mother's side, she inherited a tradition of fighting for justice in the halls of power. From her father, she inherited the first-hand knowledge of what it feels like to be a victim of profound injustice. She grew up between 2 worlds that were central to her family's identity: the storied, almost sacred Kennedy compound in Hyannisport, Massachusetts, and the green rolling hills of County Clare in Ireland. The compound was her summer sanctuary, a sprawling seaside property where generations of Kennedys had learned to sail, played ferocious games of touch football, and gathered for boisterous family reunions. It was the heart of the clan, a place where history lived in the salt-laced air and the worn floorboards of the white clapboard houses. But it was also a place of ghosts, a constant living reminder of the giants who had walked there and the immense tragedies that had befallen them. Saoirse's life in many respects followed the familiar Kennedy trajectory. She was surrounded by a large, loving, and fiercely loyal family. She was whip-smart, funny, and deeply articulate. She was educated at the prestigious Deerfield Academy, a private boarding school in the idyllic countryside of western Massachusetts, known for its rigorous academics and for molding future leaders. On the surface, her life appeared to be one of incredible privilege and boundless opportunity. She had a name that could open any door, a family that adored her, and a future that seemed destined for significance. But as is so often the case, the surface, no matter how polished and bright, tells only a fraction of the story. Beneath that promising exterior, a private, painful, and relentless struggle was taking root. And the most powerful, poignant, and ultimately important testament to that struggle comes from Saoirse herself. In 2016, while still a student at Deerfield, she did something remarkably brave. She wrote an essay for the student newspaper, the Deerfield Scroll, in which she decided to tell the unvarnished truth about her life. The article wasn't about politics or her famous family or her plans for the future. It was about her battle with mental illness. It's a piece of writing so raw, so honest, and so vulnerable that it stands as her most enduring legacy. She began with a statement of startling clarity and self-awareness for a teenager. My depression took root in the beginning of my middle school years and will be with me for the rest of my life. Consider the weight of those words. This wasn't a confession of fleeting teenage angst. This was a clear-eyed acknowledgement of a chronic medical condition, a shadow self, a companion that she understood would walk beside her forever. She described its origins with a haunting precision. Although I was mostly a happy child, I suffered bouts of deep sadness that felt like a heavy boulder on my chest. She recounted her experience of returning from a semester abroad in Ireland, a place she loved, only to find herself sinking into a profound depression, feeling isolated and untethered from her friends and her life at school. She wrote about weeping at the smallest triggers, about pushing away the very people who were trying to help her, and about the deep shame that so often accompanies mental illness, especially in a high-achieving pressure cooker environment like Deerfield. People are comfortable talking about their sports injuries, she astutely observed, but no one is comfortable talking about mental health. She cut right to the core of the stigma, the unspoken expectation that to be successful, one must also be perfect, emotionally unblemished. But the most courageous part of her essay was her admission that she had attempted to take her own life. She described how, after being gently confronted by a teacher who noticed her pain, she confessed that she had hurt herself. She felt the school's response, while well-intentioned, was to treat her illness as a disciplinary problem, as a secret to be managed rather than a wound to be healed. She was asked to leave for a time to recover, and she wrote about the profound loneliness of that experience, of feeling like a ghost, haunting the periphery of a world that didn't know how to handle her pain. Yet her essay was not a plea for pity or a cry of despair. It was a call to arms. It was an act of advocacy. She ended her piece with a challenge to her peers and her community, a plea to create a more open and compassionate environment. We are all either struggling or know someone who is struggling with mental illness, she wrote. I have experienced a lot of stigma surrounding mental health on Deerfield's campus. As students, we have the power to end that stigma. This essay was an act of profound courage. Here was a young woman, Kennedy, a name synonymous with strength and stoicism, who was choosing to redefine what strength means. She was suggesting that true strength lies not in hiding one's struggles, but in having the courage to share them, to be vulnerable, and to ask for help. She was living out her grandfather's legacy, sending forth her own tiny ripple of hope into the often silent waters of mental health. After graduating from Deerfield, Saoirse enrolled at Boston College, a university with strong Irish Catholic roots, where she majored in communications. She continued her activism, using her voice and her platform to engage with the issues of her generation. She joined student protests, worked on a campaign to end sexual assault on campus, and was a passionate advocate for gun control. She spent a summer volunteering in Mexico with an organization dedicated to building schools for indigenous communities. She was actively finding her own ways to fulfill the Kennedy family's unspoken contract of public service. Friends and family remember her as being incandescently alive. She had a wicked, self-deprecating sense of humor and a laugh that could fill a room. She was an organizer, the one who would rally the cousins for an adventure, the one who brought people together. Yet the darkness she had written about with such eloquence was a persistent and unwelcome guest. Her family was acutely aware of her struggles. They were deeply supportive, encouraging her to attend therapy and creating a space where she could be open about her feelings. Her relationship with her grandmother, Ethel, was particularly special. Despite the nearly 70-year age gap between them, they shared a powerful, intuitive bond. Saoirse would often spend quiet afternoons with Ethel at the compound in Hyannisport, the two of them just talking for hours. Ethel, a woman who had endured more grief and loss than most people could imagine, understood resilience in a way few others could. She saw in her granddaughter a kindred spirit, a young woman with a deep well of empathy, a fierce heart, and a soul that felt things, both the joys and the sorrows, with a rare and sometimes painful intensity. The summer of 2019 was, in many ways, a typical Kennedy summer. The clan had gathered at the compound, the sprawling multi-home property that has served as the family's emotional anchor for a century. It was a time for family, for sailing on the cool waters of the Nantucket Sound, for cookouts and bonfires on the private beach. Saoirse was there, just weeks away from returning to Boston College for her senior year. She was surrounded by her cousins, her aunts and uncles, and her beloved grandmother Ethel. By all accounts, she seemed happy, engaged, and full of life, laughing and talking with her family. But on the afternoon of August 1st, inside the historic home of her grandmother, the home that had been the backdrop for so much of her family's history, the unthinkable happened. Saoirse was found unconscious and unresponsive. Paramedics were called, and they rushed to the scene, their arrival shattering the idyllic peace of the summer afternoon. But it was too late. At the age of just 22, Saoirse Kennedy Hill was gone. The official cause of death was later confirmed by a toxicology report: an accidental overdose, a lethal combination of prescription medications, methadone, and alcohol. The news sent a fresh shock wave of grief, not only through the Kennedy family, but through a public that had been touched and inspired by her bravery. It was another unfathomable tragedy for a family that seemed to have already borne more than its share, but this loss felt different. This was not the result of an assassin's bullet or a fiery plane crash, or one of the sudden, violent, almost operatic tragedies that had come to define the Kennedy curse in the public imagination. This was a tragedy of a different, more insidious kind. It was a quiet, modern tragedy, the kind that plays out behind closed doors in homes all across the country, in every community, every single day. It was a death born of a silent illness, the very same illness that Saoirse had so bravely dragged into the light just a few short years before. In the aftermath, her family's response was a testament to the lessons Saoirse herself had tried to teach. They did not retreat into silence or euphemism. They were open about the cause of her death, refusing to allow her story to be shrouded in the shame and stigma she had fought so fiercely against. Her uncle, Robert F. Kennedy Jr., penned a beautiful tribute, writing, "Saoirse was fierce, both in her love for her family and her yearning for justice. The world is a little less beautiful today. Her grandmother Ethel's public statement was one of devastating, heartbreaking simplicity. Our hearts are shattered. By being honest about her struggle, they were honoring her life's most important work. Inevitably, the old narrative of the Kennedy curse was resurrected in the media. Was this just one more grim chapter in that long, sorrowful book? But to frame Saoirse's death exclusively in the context of a mystical family curse is to profoundly miss the point. The curse narrative, while dramatic and compelling, does a great disservice to her memory and to the larger, more urgent issue she represents. It suggests a kind of preordained, almost supernatural doom, obscuring the very real, very human, and very preventable factors at play. Saoirse's struggle was not the product of a curse. It was a recognized medical illness. Her death was not an act of fate. It was the tragic outcome of a disease that affects millions of people from all walks of life. The more relevant and more painful historical parallel within her own family is not with the assassinations or accidents, but with the death of her uncle David Kennedy, who died of an overdose in 1984. Both David and Saoirse were members of a generation that grew up in the shadow of their father's violent deaths. Both were described as deeply sensitive and intelligent, and both ultimately succumbed to the disease of addiction, a common and tragic outcome of unresolved generational trauma. This is not a story about a curse. This is a story about pain, trauma, and the insidious nature of mental illness. The true controversy surrounding Saoirse's death has nothing to do with her family's past, but everything to do with our society's present. Her story forces us to confront an uncomfortable truth. Saoirse Kennedy Hill had every conceivable advantage. She had access to the best medical care, a loving and deeply supportive family, financial resources, and a network of powerful friends. And still, it wasn't enough. The disease still won. Her story is a terrifying and humbling reminder that privilege, wealth, and even love are not always a sufficient shield against the darkness of depression and addiction. It compels us to ask difficult and urgent questions. Are we, as a society, truly doing enough? Are we creating a world where it is genuinely safe for people to admit they are not okay and to ask for help without judgment? Are we treating mental illness with the same urgency, compassion, and resources as we treat cancer or heart disease? Saoirse's life and her death pose these critical questions to every single one of us. So what is the historical significance of Saoirse Kennedy Hill? She will not be remembered for holding a high public office or for passing landmark legislation. Her legacy is quieter, more intimate, but no less profound or enduring. Saoirse's significance lies in her radical, courageous honesty. In an age where her generation was being taught to curate and project an image of effortless perfection on social media, she made the brave choice to share her imperfections, her pain, and her profound vulnerability with the world. She consciously used the platform that her famous name afforded her not to promote herself, but to speak a difficult, uncomfortable, and desperately necessary truth. She represents a pivotal generational shift in the ongoing conversation about mental health. She was part of a new rising generation of young people who are courageously refusing to accept the old stigmas, who are demanding a more open, honest, and compassionate dialogue about the psychological challenges they face. Her story powerfully underscored the fact that mental illness is the great equalizer. It does not discriminate based on wealth, status, or family name. It can afflict anyone, anywhere. In this way, her life became a powerful, if tragic, teaching moment, forcing the public to look beyond the sensational headlines and the patina of glamour and see the real, struggling human being underneath. Her story matters because it is a mirror. It reflects back to us the quiet, desperate struggles that are happening all around us, in our schools, in our communities, in our workplaces, and sometimes in our own homes. It is a stark reminder of the urgent, desperate need for more empathy, more understanding, and far better and more accessible systems of care for those who are fighting these battles in silence. In the end, the story of Saoirse Kennedy Hill is an undeniable tragedy, but it should not be remembered only as a tragedy. It is also a story of immense courage, of profound love, and of a bright, beautiful light that, however briefly it burned, shone with a brilliant and unforgettable intensity. She was a Kennedy, yes, with all the history and weight that name entails, but she was also, and more importantly, just Saoirse, a young woman who adored her family, who fought for what she believed in with a fierce passion, and who tried with every fiber of her being to navigate the treacherous, unforgiving terrain of her own mind. She left behind a challenge for all of us, to be a little braver in our own lives, a little more honest about our own struggles, and a little more compassionate towards the struggles of others, to have the courage to talk about the things that are hard to talk about, to make the effort to see the person behind the name, the pain behind the smile, and the incredible light that can exist even in the darkest of places. In her short, significant life, Saoirse Kennedy Hill taught us that sometimes the most powerful and lasting act of service is the simple, courageous, and revolutionary act of telling your own truth. And that is a legacy and a lesson that will endure long after the echoes of her famous name have faded into the quiet of history. And that's all for today's video. Don't forget to leave a like, comment your thoughts, and subscribe so you'll always be in the loop. Thanks for watching.